The morning bell rang through the small-town high school, echoing down the narrow halls that smelled faintly of chalk and coffee. Inside classroom 204, Mr. David Hale, a middle-aged English teacher with tired eyes and a threadbare jacket, was grading papers while the class slowly filled in. He was the kind of teacher who remembered everyone's dreams, even the ones they'd forgotten. At the back of the room sat Ethan Walker, a bright but quiet 17-year-old boy with messy hair and second-hand clothes. His notebooks were always neat, but his lunch bag was often empty. David noticed, though Ethan never asked for anything. He'd seen that look before. A young man fighting quietly against the weight of the world. That afternoon, when Ethan lingered after class, David asked softly, "Everything okay, son?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled weakly. "Yeah, just thinking. About college, about money." David nodded, pretending not to show the ache in his chest. He knew that tone, the dream that was about to die before it even had a chance. "You'll figure it out," he said gently. But when Ethan left, David sat alone for a long while, staring at the empty chair. He thought about his own life, the unpaid bills, the broken-down car, the small apartment he shared with his cat. He barely made enough to live on, but as he looked at Ethan's essay on his desk, titled "Why I Want to Be More Than My Circumstances," something inside him shifted. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Ethan's quiet words about college, about money. So he opened his laptop, logged into the school district scholarship system, and began filling out a payment form. His hands trembled. His checking account balance glared at him. Barely enough for rent. He whispered to himself, "I can manage somehow." And with one deep breath, he submitted the first anonymous payment toward Ethan's future. It wasn't much, but for David, it was everything. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, as if heaven itself was silently applauding the choice he had made. In that moment, he didn't know this small act would change both of their lives forever. The next few years passed in quiet struggle for David Hale. His shoes wore thin, his car coughed its last breath, and his rent crept higher. Yet every month, without fail, a small payment was made to an anonymous college fund under the name Ethan Walker. No one knew where it came from. Not Ethan, not the school, not even David's colleagues. He never told a soul. By day, David taught literature and reminded his students that words can change lives. By night, he worked part-time at a local diner, wiping tables and washing dishes long after the lights went out. He told everyone it was just for extra savings, but only he knew the truth, that each tip, each dollar, was another step toward Ethan's future. Ethan, meanwhile, had made it into a good university. He still lived simply, worked part-time at the library, sent money home to his mother, and often went without. But the mysterious scholarship kept him afloat. Each semester he'd receive a small email. "Your tuition has been processed. Congratulations and good luck." Sometimes he'd stare at that email for hours, wondering who could care so much about a stranger. "Maybe Dad's old friend," he once guessed. His mother just smiled sadly. "Maybe an angel," she said softly. Back in the small town, David's life grew harder. His eyesight began to fade. He skipped meals so his cat could eat. His landlord complained. Yet when his paycheck came, he'd open his worn notebook, filled with neat notes of every payment made for Ethan's tuition, and whisper, "Just one more semester. You're almost there, kid." Years blurred together. Fall leaves turning to snow, then back to green again. The world changed, but David's purpose didn't. One night, after his late diner shift, he sat by his window, watching the rain fall just like that first night years ago. His body was tired, his hands sore, but his heart was full. He whispered into the quiet, "If I can help one kid break free, maybe that's enough for a life." At that same moment, hundreds of miles away, Ethan sat alone in the campus library, finishing his essay on the people who inspire us. He stared at the last line for a long time before typing, "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes, sometimes they just believe quietly. And that's enough to change everything." Neither knew it yet, but the time was coming when their two worlds, the giver and the blessed, would finally collide. The years of sacrifice had finally begun to show. David Hale's once steady hands now trembled as he held his coffee mug. His back ached from double shifts, and the dark circles beneath his eyes told stories of nights without sleep. His apartment lights flickered often, not because of a faulty bulb, but because sometimes he couldn't afford to pay the bill on time. One cold winter morning, David sat at his desk at school, his breath faintly visible in the chilly air. The classroom heater had broken again. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, rubbing his palms together, and smiled faintly when he saw Ethan's old photo on the wall, a framed picture from graduation day. Ethan in his cap and gown, grinning, full of hope. David whispered, "You made it this far, kid, just a little more." But things were getting worse. His eyesight had grown weak, words on the page blurred, and sometimes he'd lose his balance mid-lesson. The doctor had warned him to rest, but rest wasn't a luxury he could afford. That night, while working at the diner, he felt dizzy and collapsed near the counter. The manager rushed over, shouting, "David, you okay?" He woke up moments later, embarrassed, apologizing as always. "Just tired," he said with a faint smile. When he got home, he opened his notebook, the one where he tracked every payment he'd ever made for Ethan. The last line read, "Final semester. Due in 2 weeks." He stared at his bank app. The balance barely covered rent. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Maybe I can sell the old TV. Maybe the cat food lasts a few more days." He smiled faintly, whispering, "You'll graduate, Ethan. You have to." Meanwhile, at the university, Ethan was in his final semester. He had no idea of the storm raging behind his unseen helper's kindness. He often wondered about the mysterious donor, writing thank you letters addressed simply to "my unknown supporter," leaving them at the scholarship office, even though he never got a reply. One snowy evening, while walking back from work, Ethan looked at the campus lights and whispered to himself, "Whoever you are, I'll make you proud." Back in his apartment, David sat by the window, coughing softly, a thin blanket around his shoulders. He looked out at the falling snow, his breath fogging the glass, and with a trembling smile, he whispered the same words, "I'm already proud of you, son." The spring morning was bright and full of promise, the kind of day that felt like a reward after a long winter. On the university lawn, banners fluttered, families cheered, and students in caps and gowns posed for photos beneath the open sky. Ethan Walker stood among them, heart racing, eyes searching for someone he couldn't name. He'd made it. Against every odd, every doubt, every empty wallet moment, he'd graduated. His mother cried as she hugged him, whispering, "Your father would have been so proud." Ethan smiled, but his eyes drifted beyond her, toward the empty seats in the crowd, as if waiting for someone unseen. Back in the small town miles away, David Hale sat in his worn-out armchair, watching the live stream on his cracked laptop. The video lagged, but it didn't matter. The moment Ethan walked across the stage, David froze the screen. Ethan's name echoed through his speakers. Ethan Walker, Bachelor of Literature. Tears filled David's tired eyes. He whispered to the still room, "You did it, kid. You really did it." His cat rubbed against his leg as he smiled through the tears. After the ceremony, Ethan found himself standing alone on the edge of the campus field, holding his diploma tightly. He felt overwhelming gratitude, but it was incomplete. "Whoever you are," he whispered to the wind, "thank you for believing in me when no one else did." That night, Ethan sat in his dorm, looking through all the emails and notes from the mysterious scholarship fund. Each one had the same simple format: no name, no signature, just a line, "Your tuition has been processed." Something in him refused to let the mystery go this time. He went to the financial office, asking if they could trace where the payments came from. The clerk shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. It's an anonymous donor. Always the same one. Payments came from a local high school district account, but the system doesn't show names." "A local high school?" Ethan asked, puzzled. "Yes," she said. "Looks like a teacher's contribution fund. Rarely happens these days." Ethan left the office with a thought he couldn't shake. A teacher, someone who believed in him from the start. That night, he sat under the stars with his diploma beside him and whispered, "Mr. Hale." The name came to his lips before he could even think. He remembered his English teacher's warm smile, his constant encouragement, the way he always said, "You can rise above your circumstances." The next morning, Ethan packed a small bag and took the first bus back to his hometown. He didn't know what he'd say or what he'd find, but deep down, something told him it was time to finally meet the man who had quietly built his future, brick by brick. Meanwhile, in his small, dimly lit apartment, David coughed into a handkerchief, the screen still frozen on Ethan's smiling face. The rent notice lay unopened on the table, but there was peace in his eyes and a quiet smile on his lips. He had no idea that the boy he once called son, in silence, was now on his way home. The bus rumbled down familiar roads lined with fading houses and autumn leaves that swirled like memories in the wind. Ethan sat by the window, clutching his backpack and staring out with a quiet determination in his eyes. The town looked smaller now, older, emptier, but every corner held a piece of his past. He stepped off the bus, and walked through the streets that once led him to high school. The grocery store still had the same cracked sign, and the diner on the corner still smelled of coffee and fried eggs. Everything looked the same, except him. He had grown, not just in age, but in gratitude. When he reached the old high school, the halls echoed faintly with voices and laughter. The janitor, an old man with kind eyes, looked up and smiled. "You look familiar, son." Ethan smiled back. "I used to be a student here." Ethan Walker. Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "Ah, yes, Mr. Hale's student. He used to talk about you, you know. Said you had something special." Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. "Is he still teaching here?" The janitor's face softened. "No, son. He retired last year. Not by choice, though. His health's been failing. Lives a few blocks down Maple Street now. Small apartment near the bookstore." Ethan thanked him and walked out, his chest tightening with every step toward Maple Street. The closer he got, the slower his feet moved. What would he even say? "Thank you. I'm sorry I never knew. You saved my life." When he finally reached the small building, he saw the familiar rusty mailbox with a handwritten label, D. Hale, Apt 2B. He stood there for a long time, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Inside, David Hale was sitting by the window, reading one of his old literature books through foggy glasses. His cat slept on his lap. The apartment was dim, quiet, a place that had seen both struggle and peace. A soft knock echoed through the door. David looked up, surprised. Visitors were rare. He slowly got up and opened the door. There stood Ethan, taller now, dressed in a simple shirt, holding his diploma in one hand and tears in his eyes. For a moment, time froze. "Mr. Hale," Ethan's voice cracked. "It was you, wasn't it? You're the reason I made it through college." David's lips parted, but no words came out. He just looked at the young man before him, the boy he'd once helped from afar, now standing tall, filled with life and gratitude. He tried to smile. "You didn't need to come all this way, Ethan." "I did," Ethan said, his eyes glistening. "I needed to see the man who believed in me when no one else did." David looked down, trying to hide the emotion trembling through him. "I just wanted you to have a chance." Ethan stepped closer, and without another word, hugged him tightly. The old man froze, then slowly, his trembling hands rose and held him back. Tears streamed down Ethan's face. "You're more of a father to me than anyone ever was," David whispered, "and you're the son I never had." Outside, the autumn leaves fell gently against the window, and for the first time in years, David Hale didn't feel poor or alone. He felt rich in purpose, in love, in the legacy he had built quietly through sacrifice. The morning sun spilled gently through the blinds of Mr. Hale's small apartment, painting soft gold across the worn floorboards. The air was still, peaceful, almost sacred. On the kitchen table sat 2 cups of coffee, one chipped, one new. Ethan had made breakfast, though neither of them had eaten much. Their hearts were too full for words. David sat quietly, a faint smile on his face. "You didn't have to do all this, Ethan," he said softly. Ethan shook his head. "After everything you did for me, it's the least I can do." But even as they shared small talk, stories, laughter, tears, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that what Mr. Hale had done needed to be known. Not for fame, not for sympathy, but because the world needed to remember that kindness like his still existed. That night, back at his hotel, Ethan sat at the small desk with his laptop open. The words flowed like a river that had been waiting for years to burst free. He titled the letter simply, "To the teacher who paid for my future." He wrote about the boy who dreamed of college but couldn't afford it, about the teacher who saw potential when no one else did, about the anonymous payments, the late nights, the quiet sacrifices. He never asked for thanks. He never wanted recognition, but every degree, every dream, every life changed because of people like him. That's his reward. "Mr. Hale taught me that true wealth isn't in what we have, but in what we give away." Ethan didn't realize how many tears had fallen until he saw them glisten on the keyboard. He finished the letter with one final line. "If you're reading this, and you ever had someone believe in you quietly, find them, thank them, because behind every success story, there's a soul like Mr. Hale's, who gave without ever asking for anything in return." He uploaded the letter to a popular educational blog, just hoping it might reach a few readers who'd appreciate it. But within hours, the post went viral. Thousands shared it. Teachers, students, parents, everyone. Headlines appeared. "The teacher who secretly paid his students tuition. A silent hero found." Reporters began reaching out. Schools sent messages of gratitude. Donations flooded in for David Hale. But when Ethan showed him the article, the old man smiled faintly and said, "I never did it for the world, son. I just did it for you." Ethan held back tears. "I know, Mr. Hale, but now the world knows who you are and what love really looks like." That evening, As the sun set outside the apartment, David looked out the window, his hands trembling slightly as he held a letter from the school district offering to rename the scholarship fund in his honor, the David Hale Future Scholars Program. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not for what he gave up, but for what he gave. He looked at Ethan and said softly, "I guess every story finds its ending eventually." Ethan smiled through his tears. "No, sir. Yours just began." Outside, the light faded into gold, wrapping the small apartment in warmth, the same warmth that had quietly carried one young man's dreams for years. Months had passed since the heartfelt reunion between Ethan and Mr. Hale. The letter Ethan wrote had gone viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. People across the country read about a humble teacher who sacrificed quietly and a student who never forgot. Schools started talking about the story. Teachers found new hope, and students began looking at their mentors with new eyes. Mr. Hale's health, though fragile, seemed to glow with a quiet happiness. Every morning, he'd sit by the window with his cat and open his mail. Letters from strangers all over America. Some wrote, "You reminded me why I became a teacher." Others wrote, "You made me believe kindness still exists." Ethan visited often. Sometimes they talked about books, sometimes about life, but mostly they just sat together, the silence between them filled with unspoken gratitude. One day, Ethan walked in holding an envelope and said, "Mr. Hale, I have something for you." Inside was a set of documents, the creation of a foundation called the Hale Scholarship Fund. "It's in your name," Ethan said softly, "for students like me, those who have dreams but no means. This is your legacy, sir. Your kindness will keep sending kids to college long after we're gone." Mr. Hale's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do that, Ethan." Ethan smiled. "You didn't have to pay for my education either, but you did, quietly, humbly. This is how I say thank you." The old teacher reached out and placed his hand over Ethan's. "Then promise me one thing. Never stop believing in people, even when the world doesn't." Years later, a small ceremony was held at the school where it all began. A plaque on the wall read, "In memory of Mr. David Hale, a teacher who gave more than he had and believed more than he should have." Ethan stood in front of the students, his voice steady but emotional. He wasn't rich in money, but rich in heart. And if there's one thing I learned from him, it's this: the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire life. The audience stood in silence, many with tears in their eyes. Somewhere in that quiet moment, Ethan felt it, the same warmth he had felt years ago when he first opened that anonymous envelope. Mr. Hale's story had come full circle, from a small classroom to the hearts of millions. His name might fade from the headlines, but his legacy, the love, the sacrifice, the faith in others, would live on forever. As the sun set over the old school, Ethan whispered to himself, "You didn't just teach me how to write, sir. You taught me how to live." Moral lesson from a poor teacher secretly pays his students' college fees. 1. True kindness needs no recognition. Real generosity is done in silence, not for praise, but for love and belief in someone's future. 2. A teacher's influence never ends. The lessons of compassion, sacrifice, and hope live far beyond the classroom. 3. Gratitude is the bridge between hearts. When we remember those who helped us, we keep their spirit alive forever. 4. Money doesn't define richness. A poor man with a kind heart is far richer than a wealthy man with none. 5. One act of kindness can change generations. Mr. Hale's secret help didn't just educate one student, it inspired thousands to believe in goodness again. In the end, this story reminds us that sometimes the smallest sacrifices create the biggest legacies.